They were going to execute him at dawn until his parrot screamed the truth so loud that even the guards froze in place. Welcome back, and enjoy what might be the best story you'll watch today. The fluorescent lights above Harold Tucker's cell buzzed with the relentless persistence of dying insects, their harsh white glare casting jagged shadows across concrete walls that had become his entire universe for 12 endless years. Each morning brought the same ritual of awakening, not to hope, never to hope, but to the familiar symphony of institutional despair that echoed through Block E of the Huntsville unit, like a dirge for the living dead. The metallic taste of fear and resignation coated Harold's tongue as his eyes opened to another day that brought him closer to his appointment with the state's idea of justice. Harold's weathered hands, marked by liver spots and crossed with scars from a dozen small accidents that came with ranch life, traced the familiar network of cracks in the cement wall beside his narrow cot. These fissures had become his roadmap through madness, each one memorized and catalogued during the countless hours when sleep refused to come. The longest crack started near the ceiling, jagged as lightning, and descended toward the floor in a pattern that reminded him of the Trinity River back home, the way it wound through the East Texas hills where he once owned 43 acres of he once owned 43 acres. Scrubland and dreams. That ranch seemed like another man's life now, viewed through the distorting lens of 12 years of injustice. Harold could still remember the smell of morning coffee brewing in his kitchen, while Charlie, his green-winged macaw, squawked good-natured complaints about being awakened too early. The parrot had been his constant companion for 8 years before that terrible night, when Detective Mendel's lies had torn their world apart with the brutal efficiency of a tornado through a trailer park. The cell measured exactly 8 feet by 10 feet. Harold had paced off the dimensions countless times during his first year of incarceration, when he still harbored illusions that someone would discover the truth and set him free. The space was smaller than most people's bathrooms, containing nothing but a steel cot bolted to the wall, a combination toilet and sink that barely functioned, and a narrow table that served as desk, dining surface, and the closest thing to privacy he had known since 2011. Every inch of this tomb bore witness to his gradual transformation from a man who whistled while he worked to a hollow-eyed specter who had forgotten the sound of his own laughter. Outside his cell, the familiar morning cacophony of prison life began its daily performance. Steel doors clanged shut with the finality of coffin lids, their echoes bouncing off walls, painted the color of institutional despair. Guards' boots clicked against polished floors in rhythmic patterns that had become Harold's metronome, marking time in a place where time served no purpose, except to torture those who still remembered what freedom felt like. Somewhere down the corridor, Martinez was having another nightmare, screaming in Spanish about the fire that had consumed his family. 2 cells over, old Thompson coughed with the wet, rattling sound of lungs slowly drowning in their own fluids. The state didn't provide much medical care for men it planned to kill. The morning light, filtering through Harold's narrow window 18 inches wide, 6 inches tall, covered with mesh that cast everything in a crosshatch pattern, painted his world in shades of gray and amber. It was the color of autumn leaves he would never see again, of sunset drives through the piney woods that existed now only in memory. Harold's reflection in the small metal mirror, bolted to his wall, showed a stranger wearing his face hollow cheeks carved by 12 years of institutional food and chronic stress. Eyes that had once sparkled with the simple joy of a man who loved his land and his animals now dulled to the color of old pennies. His hair had gone completely white, not gradually as nature intended, but in a sudden shock that occurred during his 3rd year of appeals, when his lawyer had explained with practiced detachment that the DNA evidence that might have exonerated him had somehow disappeared from the evidence locker. The state had stolen his youth, his hope, his faith in humanity, and his belief that truth mattered in America. They had taken his home, sold at auction to pay legal fees that accomplished nothing except to enrich lawyers who spoke in measured tones about reasonable doubt, while knowing the system had already decided his fate. They had destroyed his reputation, turning him from Harold Tucker, the quiet rancher who helped his neighbors during harvest season, into Harold Tucker, the monster who had allegedly murdered Sarah Beth Montgomery in cold blood, for reasons no one could adequately explain. But through 12 years of systematic destruction, they had never quite managed to steal his memory of Charlie. The name alone brought the first genuine emotion Harold had felt in months, a warmth that started in his chest and spread outward like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Charlie had been more than a pet. He had been family, friend, confidant, and the closest thing to unconditional love Harold had ever known. The green-winged macaw possessed more loyalty than any human had ever shown Harold, with feathers that shimmered like emeralds in sunlight and golden eyes that held an intelligence most people refused to acknowledge in animals. Charlie had come into Harold's life during his divorce proceedings, when his ex-wife Linda was systematically destroying everything they had built together over 15 years of marriage. The bird had been owned by an elderly woman who died without family, and Harold had adopted him from the county shelter more out of loneliness than any particular desire for a pet. But Charlie had quickly become the center of Harold's world, a constant presence who filled the silence of a house that had once echoed with arguments and bitter recriminations. The parrot used to perch on Harold's shoulder while he mended fences, his sharp beak occasionally nibbling at Harold's ear in what seemed like affection. Charlie would squawk running commentary about the weather, perfectly mimicking the local news anchor's voice when he announced the morning temperature. During the hottest part of summer days, the bird would retreat to the shade of the porch, preening his magnificent feathers while Harold worked, but always keeping one golden eye on his human companion. In the evenings, after Harold had finished his chores and showered off the day's sweat and dust, Charlie would settle beside his favorite recliner while Harold read the Tyler County Tribune aloud. The bird's head would tilt with apparent interest at every word, occasionally interjecting his own commentary, or perfectly mimicking the sound of Harold's laugh. Sometimes Charlie would repeat entire phrases from the newspaper in Harold's own voice, his pronunciation so perfect that visitors often did double takes, wondering if Harold was talking to himself. The memory of their separation still burned like acid in Harold's throat, as vivid and painful as if it had happened yesterday instead of 12 years ago. When the police had burst through his front door with their warrant and their preconceived notions of guilt, Charlie had gone wild in his large cage, screaming and beating his powerful wings against the bars until green and red feathers came loose and drifted to the floor like confetti at a funeral. The parrot had bitten 2 officers before they could cover his cage with a heavy blanket, all while shrieking words that made Harold's heart break into pieces that had never fully healed. "No hurt, Harold. Charlie say no. No bad men. Go away." But nobody listened to a bird's testimony, especially when Detective Randall Mendel's version of events painted such a convincing picture of guilt. Mendel had been the lead investigator on Sarah Beth Montgomery's murder case, a 20-year veteran of the Tyler County Sheriff's Department with a reputation for solving difficult cases. He was the one who claimed to have witnessed Harold fleeing the scene of the crime, the one whose testimony had sealed Harold's fate with its apparent certainty and professional authority. Now, as Harold sat on the edge of his narrow cot, watching dust motes dance in the morning light like tiny ghosts, he wondered if Charlie even remembered him. 12 years was a significant portion of a human lifespan, but for a macaw that could live 80 years or more, it might feel like yesterday. Did the bird still remember Harold's voice? Did he still repeat the phrases Harold had taught him? "Good morning, sunshine. Time for dinner. I love you, Charlie." Or had new owners filled his vocabulary with different words, different memories, different affections? The thought that Charlie might have forgotten him entirely was almost more painful than the prospect of tomorrow's execution. At least death would end Harold's suffering. But the idea that he had been erased from the memory of the only living being who had truly loved him felt like a kind of spiritual annihilation that went beyond mere physical death. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted Harold's spiral into despair. These weren't the routine footsteps of guards making their hourly rounds, checking to ensure that condemned men hadn't somehow cheated the state of its pound of flesh. These boots moved with purpose, with the weight of significance, with the measured cadence of men carrying news that would change everything or nothing, depending on one's perspective on what constituted change in a place where time had stopped. Moving forward 12 years ago, Warden Morrison appeared at Harold's cell door, his face bearing the carefully composed expression he had perfected over 23 years of overseeing executions. Behind him stood Chaplain Williams, whose presence meant only one thing in the predetermined choreography of state-sanctioned death. Harold's hands began to tremble despite his efforts to remain calm, despite the mental rehearsals he had conducted for this moment, despite the meditation techniques he had learned from a Buddhist inmate who had achieved his own form of peace, free. Years earlier, when the state had stopped his heart with a cocktail of lethal chemicals, Harold had known this day would come eventually. Every appeal had been denied. Every legal maneuver had failed. Every last-ditch effort to prove his innocence had been ground to dust beneath the wheels of a justice system that valued finality over truth. He prepared himself for this conversation in 1,000 different ways, had practiced maintaining his dignity in the face of the ultimate indignity. But nothing could truly prepare a man for hearing his own death sentence carried out without bureaucratic efficiency. Harold, Warden Morrison's voice carried the weight of 12 years of familiarity, mixed with professional distance. He was a decent man trapped in an indecent system, and Harold had always sensed his discomfort with the role fate had assigned him. The governor has denied your final appeal. The Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 7-0 against commutation. The execution is scheduled for dawn tomorrow. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, visible and toxic and impossible to ignore. Harold closed his eyes and felt something inside his chest crack, not his heart, which had broken years ago and been crudely patched together with resignation and stubborn survival instinct, but something deeper and more fundamental. His soul, perhaps, finally accepting what his mind had always known, but his spirit had refused to acknowledge. That innocence meant nothing when the system had decided you were guilty. That truth was irrelevant when lies were more convenient. That truth was irrelevant when lies were more convenient. Justice was a fairy tale told to children who hadn't yet learned how the world really worked. When Harold opened his eyes again, both men were studying his face with the clinical interest of scientists observing a specimen in its final moments. They expected tears, perhaps, or rage, or desperate pleas for mercy that would make them uncomfortable but wouldn't change anything. They had seen it all before: the bargaining, the denial, the collapse into hysteria that sometimes accompanied the final realization that tomorrow's sunrise would be viewed through different eyes, or not at all. Instead, Harold surprised them with a question that seemed to come from somewhere outside himself, from a part of his personality that had remained hidden during 12 years of systematic dehumanization. "Can I make a final request?" Warden Morrison nodded slowly, mentally preparing himself for another heartbreaking plea. In his experience, condemned men's final requests usually fell into predictable categories: expensive meals that attempted to pack a lifetime of pleasure into a single dining experience, religious ceremonies that offered the hope of redemption in the next world, if not in this one, phone calls to family members who had long since stopped accepting collect calls from death row, or visits from old friends who had moved on with their lives and preferred to remember the condemned man as he had been, rather than what he had become. "I want to see Charlie." The warden's eyebrows drew together in confusion, his mental catalog of final requests failing to provide context for this unusual name. "Charlie? Your lawyer?" "Harold, you know attorney visits have to be scheduled through." "No." Harold's voice grew stronger, more certain than it had been in years, as if the simple act of speaking Charlie's name had restored some essential part of himself that had been buried beneath layers of institutional trauma. "Charlie is my parrot, my bird. I want to see him one more time before." He gestured vaguely at the cell walls, at the calendar that counted down to tomorrow, at the entire apparatus of state-sanctioned death that surrounded them, unable to speak the words that would make tomorrow's reality too concrete to bear. Chaplain Williams shifted uncomfortably, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor as he exchanged glances with the warden. In all his years of ministering to condemned men, providing spiritual comfort to souls preparing to meet their maker, he had never heard such a request. Most inmates wanted to reconnect with family members, make peace with God through elaborate religious ceremonies, or simply enjoy one last taste of freedom through a carefully prepared meal that reminded them of better times. "But a parrot, Harold," the warden said carefully, his voice carrying the gentle tone he used when explaining harsh realities to men who were already living the harshest reality imaginable. "I don't even know if your bird is still alive. It's been 12 years. And even if he is, tracking down a pet from that long ago, it's not exactly standard procedure. We'd have to contact animal control, check with local shelters, maybe put out some kind of public notice. The logistics alone. Something flickered in Harold's eyes. "Not hope, exactly. because hope was a luxury he had learned to live without. But something close to it, a spark of the man he had been before the system had tried to grind him into dust. Charlie's tough. Macaws live a long time, 70 or 80 years if they're cared for properly. And he's smart, smarter than most people give birds credit for. If anyone would remember, if anyone would survive, it would be Charlie. The weight of the moment settled over all three men like a heavy blanket. Here was a man facing death at dawn, using his final request, not for comfort or closure, or one last connection to the human family that had abandoned him, but for a reunion with the only living being who had shown him unconditional love. The request was unusual, impractical, probably impossible to fulfill, given the time constraints and bureaucratic obstacles that surrounded every aspect of prison operations. But something in Harold's voice, the quiet dignity with which he faced his fate, the simple honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose, the desperate love of someone who wanted to say goodbye to the only family he had left made it impossible to dismiss the request as the delusion of a condemned man grasping at straws. "I'll see what I can do," Warden Morrison heard himself saying, though he had no idea how he would even begin such a search. "No promises, Harold, but I'll make some calls." As the two men walked away, their footsteps echoing down the corridor, like a countdown clock marking the hours until dawn, Harold settled back onto his cot and stared at the ceiling that had become as familiar as the sky he would never see again. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember not just Charlie, but the life they had shared together before Detective Mendel's lies had destroyed everything good and decent in Harold's world. He remembered the small ranch house with its wraparound porch, where Charlie's large cage sat in the morning sun, the parrot preening his magnificent feathers, while Harold drank his first cup of coffee and planned his day. He remembered the vegetable garden where Charlie would help by pulling up seedlings and dropping them at Harold's feet with the proud expression of a cat bringing home a dead mouse. He remembered the quiet evenings when man and bird would sit together on the porch, comfortable in each other's company, neither needing words to communicate the bond that had formed between two very different species, united by loneliness and mutually affection. Those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life now, like frames from a movie he had watched long ago and half forgotten. But as Harold closed his eyes and listened to the familiar sounds of the prison around him, the distant conversations of guards, the electronic buzz of security systems, the occasional cry of despair from another condemned man wrestling with his own, Demantia could almost hear Charlie's voice calling his name in that perfect mimicry that had never failed to make him smile. Maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to die completely alone. 6 hours away, in a small animal sanctuary on the outskirts of Tyler where the East Texas piney woods gave way to rolling pastureland, Martha Simmons was having the strangest day of her 30-year career rehabilitating unwanted pets. She had started the morning like any other, feeding the dogs who barked their gratitude from behind chain-link fences, cleaning the cat enclosures where felines of every description waited for forever homes that might never come, administering medications to the elderly animals that nobody else wanted because they weren't cute enough or young enough or healthy enough to attract adoption. Martha's sanctuary existed in the gray area between official animal control and private charity, taking in the cases that other organizations couldn't or wouldn't handle. She had seen every form of animal cruelty and neglect that human creativity could devise, had nursed back to health creatures that had been abandoned, abused, and written off as hopeless. But in 30 years of this work, she had never received a phone call quite like the one that came at 2:17 that afternoon. "Ma'am, this is Warden Morrison from the Huntsville unit," the voice on the other end had said, its professional tone carrying an undertone of desperation that made Martha sit down hard in her office chair. "I'm trying to locate a parrot named Charlie that belonged to one of our inmates. I know it's a long shot, but we're hoping someone might remember taking in a bird about 12 years ago from the Tyler County area." Martha's eyes had immediately gone to the large cage in the corner of her office, where a magnificent green-winged macaw sat preening his feathers in the afternoon sunlight streaming through her window. Charlie had been with her for 11 years now, ever since the county animal control had brought him in after his owner was arrested for murder. The bird had been traumatized beyond anything she'd ever encountered, refusing to speak, biting anyone who tried to handle him, and displaying the kind of desperate aggression that spoke of a deep psychological wound. Most sanctuaries would have euthanized Charlie after the first few months of violence and silence. Aggressive birds were considered unadoptable, and the resources required to rehabilitate them were better spent on animals with better prospects for finding homes. But something about Charlie's eyes, the intelligence that flickered behind the trauma, the way he would sometimes cock his head, as if listening to voices only he could hear, had convinced Martha to keep trying. It had taken 2 full years before Charlie spoke his first word in her care, and even then, it was just a whisper in the middle of the night that Martha had almost missed. Harold. Over the following years, she had pieced together fragments of the bird's vocabulary, strange phrases that seemed to come from another life entirely. Mendel lied. Don't hurt Harold. Charlie saw everything. Bad men go away. She had always assumed these were just echoes of trauma, meaningless repetitions from a bird's fractured memory, attempting to process experiences too terrible for his avian mind to fully comprehend. But now, listening to the warden's careful explanation of Harold Tucker's final request, Martha felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in her small office. The inmate's name is Harold Tucker, Warden Morrison was saying, his voice carrying the weight of a man trying to fulfill an impossible promise to a dying man. He was convicted of murdering a woman named Sarah Beth Montgomery back in 2011. He's scheduled for execution tomorrow at dawn, and he's asked to see his bird one last time. I know it's highly irregular, and I understand if you can't help, but Martha looked at Charlie, who had stopped preening and was watching her with those intelligent golden eyes that seemed to hold secrets she was only beginning to understand. "Bah, Warden Morrison," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I have your bird." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and frantic preparation that tested every bureaucratic system the Texas Department of Criminal Justice had ever devised. The prison administration had never received a request quite like this one, and every level of hierarchy seemed determined to create obstacles. Legal departments worried about liability issues. Security personnel questioned the wisdom of bringing an unpredictable animal into a maximum security facility. Administrative assistants demanded forms that didn't exist for situations that had never been anticipated. But something about the story, an innocent man facing death, asking only to see his beloved pet one last time, seemed to touch even the most hardened officials. Perhaps it was the fundamental humanity of the request, the simple desire for connection that transcended species and circumstance. Perhaps it was the tragedy of a man who had been abandoned by the human community, but still held love for a creature that couldn't testify on his behalf or petition for his release. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that in a system designed to dehumanize and destroy, small acts of mercy were the only things that preserved the souls of those who worked within it. By evening, after calls to the governor's office, consultations with the attorney general, and hurried meetings between department heads who had never faced such a decision, Martha had received official permission to bring Charlie to the prison for a final visit. The paperwork alone filled a manila folder thick enough to serve as a doorstop, but every signature and stamp represented another small victory for compassion over bureaucracy. As Martha loaded Charlie's cage into her van, carefully securing it with bungee cords and blankets to minimize the stress of the journey, she felt a mixture of excitement and dread that made her hands shake. She had read about Harold Tucker's case years ago, had followed the appeals and the protests from people who believed in his innocence. The story had haunted Hara, quiet man with no criminal history, convicted on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a single police officer, facing death for a crime that made no sense given everything known about his character. Now she was about to reunite him with the one living being who had shared his life before it all went wrong. But she was also bringing Charlie to watch his beloved human die, and she wasn't sure any of them were prepared for that kind of goodbye. Animals grieved differently than humans, but they grieved nonetheless, and Martha had seen pets waste away after losing the people they loved. The drive to Huntsville took place mostly in darkness, with Charlie unusually quiet in his covered cage. Martha had expected him to chatter or sing during the journey, as he often did on trips to the veterinarian, or during the rare occasions when potential adopters came to visit. Instead, the bird seemed to sense the gravity of their mission, remaining silent except for the occasional soft click of his beak or rustle of feathers that indicated he was awake and alert. As they approached the prison complex, its harsh floodlights cutting through the East Texas darkness like searchlights scanning for escaped prisoners, Martha wondered what they would find. Would Harold even recognize Charlie after all these years? Would the bird remember the man who had once been his entire world? And what would happen after their reunion? When dawn brought the finality that no amount of love could prevent, the prison gates loomed ahead, stark and unforgiving under the artificial lights that turned night into a harsh approximation of day. Guard towers rose like concrete monuments to humanity's capacity for institutionalized vengeance, their spotlights sweeping back and forth in patterns designed to remind everyone within their reach that freedom was an illusion and escape was impossible. Martha took a deep breath, whispered a prayer to whatever powers might be listening to the desperate pleas of those who worked to heal rather than harm, and drove toward a reunion that would change everything for everyone involved, though none of them knew it yet. Behind the concrete walls and razor wire, Harold Tucker lay on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling and trying to prepare his heart for what might be his final joy and his final goodbye. Tomorrow, the state of Texas planned to stop his heart with a carefully measured cocktail of lethal chemicals, ending 12 years of waiting and a lifetime of dreams that had been systematically destroyed by lies and indifference. But tonight, just maybe he would see Charlie one more time. Neither man nor bird could have imagined that their reunion would do more than provide comfort in the darkest hour either had ever faced. Neither could have foreseen that Charlie's memory, sharp as his talons and true as his heart, held the key to a truth that had been buried for 12 long years beneath layers of corruption and cover-up. And neither could have predicted that sometimes when human justice fails completely, divine justice arrives on wings, carried by a voice that never learned to lie and had never forgotten what it had witnessed on a terrible night when innocence died and guilt walked free. The fluorescent lights continued their eternal buzzing, but for the first time in 12 years, Harold Tucker fell asleep with something that felt almost like hope, warming his chest like a small flame against the darkness. Tomorrow would bring either death or deliverance, but tonight, Charlie was coming home to the man who loved him more than life itself. And in that small miracle of reunion, the seeds of a much larger miracle were already beginning to grow. The visitation room of the Huntsville unit had witnessed countless final goodbyes over the decades, tearful embraces between condemned men and the family members who still loved them, desperate conversations with lawyers making last-minute appeals, solemn meetings with spiritual advisors, preparing souls for whatever came after death. But at 11:47 p.m., on what was supposed to be Harold Tucker's final night on Earth, the room was about to host something unprecedented in the annals of American corrections: the reunion of a man and his beloved Parrot. Martha Simmons wheeled Charlie's covered cage through the security checkpoint, past metal detectors that had never been calibrated for bird visits, through corridors painted the institutional green that was supposed to be calming, but instead reminded everyone of hospitals and morgues. The guards who escorted her moved with the careful precision of men following protocols that had been hastily written that afternoon by administrators who had never imagined such a scenario. Harold had been brought to the visitation room 15 minutes earlier, his wrists and ankles shackled with chains that clinked softly with each movement. He sat at a metal table bolted to the floor, wearing the white cotton uniform reserved for condemned prisoners, his hands folded in his lap to hide their trembling. When he heard the wheels of Charlie's cage rolling across the linoleum floor, his entire body went rigid with an anticipation so intense it was almost painful. The guard positioned Charlie's cage directly across from Harold, separated by 4 feet of empty space that might as well have been an ocean. The heavy blanket that covered the cage created a small tent of darkness, hiding whatever changes 12 years might have wrought on the bird Harold remembered as magnificent and vibrant. For a moment, nobody moved. Harold stared at the covered cage, as if he could see through the fabric by sheer force of will, while Martha stood nearby with her hand on the blanket's edge, waiting for some signal that would never come because no protocol existed for such moments. "Charlie?" Harold's voice was barely above a whisper, cracked by years of disuse, and weighted with the kind of longing that came from loving something that had been taken away too soon. "Charlie, is that you?" Martha looked to the warden, who nodded almost imperceptibly. With hands that shook from nervousness and anticipation, she pulled away the blanket and revealed the magnificent green-winged macaw, who had been Harold's world before everything went wrong. Charlie had grown even more beautiful in the years of separation. his feathers now displaying the full majesty of a mature macaw. The green that covered most of his body shimmered like emeralds under the harsh fluorescent lights, while the red patches on his wings seemed to glow with their own inner fire. His tail feathers, nearly 3 feet long, displayed bands of blue and gold that caught the light as he shifted nervously on his perch. But it was his eyes, those intelligent golden eyes that had watched Harold through morning coffee and evening newspapers, that held everyone's attention as they fixed immediately on the man across the room. For several heartbeats, neither man nor bird moved. Harold stared at Charlie with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail, while Charlie tilted his head in that characteristic gesture that Harold remembered so well, studying the human who had once been the center of his world. The bird had aged. Harold could see that now. There were subtle changes in the set of his feathers, a slight dulling of the colors that spoke of time past, and care given by strangers rather than family. Then Charlie went completely still, his feathers puffing out until he appeared nearly twice his normal size. His golden eyes widened, and he let out a sound that was part screech, part cry of recognition that made every person in the room take an involuntary step backward. And then he screamed, but not the angry, territorial scream of a frightened bird. This was something else, entirely a sound of such pure anguish and desperate communication that it seemed to come from the very depths of the creature's soul. Charlie threw himself against the bars of his cage with such violence that Martha feared he would injure himself, his powerful wings beating frantically as words poured out of him in a torrent of perfect mimicry and desperate memory. "No, don't kill Harold, he didn't do it. Mendel lied? Mendel lied." The words hit the room like physical blows. Every person present, guards, administrators, the chaplain, who had come to witness this unusual final visit, froze in place, as if struck by lightning. Mendel, Detective Randall Mendel, the man whose testimony had sealed Harold's fate, whose eyewitness account had been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. "He lied. Charlie saw. Mendel hurtled. Not Harold, not Harold." The parrot's voice was Harold's voice, perfectly reproduced after 12 years of separation. But the words were Charlie's memory, preserved with the crystal clarity that only animals seemed capable of maintaining. The bird continued his desperate testimony, each phrase hitting the stunned humans like a revelation. "Bad man came, hurt lady." Harold sleeping. Charlie saw everything. Silence fell like thunder. The warden stood frozen, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Chaplain Williams crossed himself, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or simply shock. The guards exchanged glances that spoke of their discomfort with witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about guilt and innocence. Harold was crying. After years of holding back tears, of maintaining the stoic dignity that was the only armor condemned men possessed, he was sobbing with the abandon of a man watching the ghost of truth rise from its grave. He reached toward Charlie's cage with shackled hands, and the bird immediately pressed against the bars closest to him, his agitation subsiding as he focused on the human he had never forgotten. "Oh, Charlie, you remember everything." The parrot cocked his head, studying Harold's face with the intensity of a creature processing information beyond human understanding. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more intimate, carrying the weight of 12 years of separation and the joy of an impossible reunion. "Harold home?" Charlie missed Harold. "Where you been?" It was a child's question, innocent and heartbreaking, spoken in Harold's own voice, but carrying Charlie's confused devotion. The bird had no concept of prison or execution, or the legal system that had torn them apart. He only knew that his beloved human had disappeared one terrible night and was now, miraculously, within sight again. Martha Simmons found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Warden Morrison?" About Detective Mendel, the warden's face had gone ashen. In 23 years of overseeing executions, he had never encountered anything like this. He had seen condemned men protest their innocence right up until the needle entered their veins, had heard every possible plea and explanation and desperate last-minute revelation. But this was different. This was testimony from a witness who had no reason to lie, no understanding of the consequences, no agenda beyond the simple truth of what had been observed and remembered. "Where did the bird learn those words?" Warden Morrison asked, though he was already beginning to understand the terrible implications of Charlie's outburst. Martha's voice was stronger now, gaining conviction as the pieces of a 12-year-old puzzle began falling into place. He's been saying those things for years, Mendel lied. Don't hurt Harold. Charlie saw everything. I always thought they were just random phrases from his past, trauma responses that didn't mean anything. But now we know better, Harold said quietly, his tears still flowing, but his voice steady with the kind of calm that came from finally being vindicated after a lifetime of injustice. Charlie was there that night. He saw everything. Detective Mendel didn't just lie about seeing me flee the scene. He was the one who killed Sarah Beth Montgomery. Charlie bobbed his head as if confirming Harold's words, then launched into another stream of testimony that made everyone in the room realize they were witnessing the unraveling of a 12-year-old conspiracy. Mendel came to house. Lady scared. Harold sleeping. Charlie quiet. Bad man hurt lady. Make her stop moving. Then he see Charlie. Try to hurt Charlie too. But Charlie fly. Charlie hide. The narrative was fragmentary but clear enough to paint a picture that turned the prosecution's case inside out. Detective Mendel had come to Harold's property that night not as an investigating officer, but as a perpetrator. Sarah Beth Montgomery, Harold's neighbor, who had been found murdered in his barn, had apparently run there seeking help from Mendel's attack. Harold, who suffered from sleep apnea and took medication that made him sleep deeply, had been unconscious in his house, while the real killer pursued his victim to what should have been safety. He framed me, Harold said, his voice carrying the weight of 12 years of suppressed rage and vindication. Mendel killed her, then used his position as the investigating officer to pin it on me. And Charlie saw it all. Charlie continued his testimony, each word delivered in Harold's perfectly mimicked voice, but carrying the bird's authentic memory. Mendel find Harold sleeping. Take Harold's shirt. Put on dead lady. Make mess. Then call other police. Say Harold did bad thing. The room spun slightly for Warden Morrison as the full magnitude of what he was hearing sank in. If the bird was telling the truth hand, what reason would a parrot have to fabricate such an elaborate lie? Then the state of Texas was preparing to execute an innocent man based on the testimony of the real killer. The thought made him physically ill. Have you ever experienced or known someone who has experienced being falsely accused of something you didn't do? Share your experience in the comments. We need to stop the execution, Martha said urgently, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. Right now, this minute. You can't proceed with this knowing what we know. Warden Morrison nodded, already reaching for his phone. I'm calling the governor's office, and the attorney general, and probably the FBI. He paused, looking at Charlie with something approaching awe. In 30 years in corrections, I've never seen anything like this. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of emergency phone calls and hastily convened meetings that pulled judges from their beds and prosecutors from their homes. The governor's mansion lit up like Christmas as staff members tried to process the unprecedented situation of a parrot providing exonerating testimony for a condemned man. Legal experts were consulted, precedents were researched, and politicians who had built careers on being tough on crime suddenly found themselves facing the nightmare scenario of executing an innocent man on live television. At 4:17 a.m., with dawn beginning to gray the eastern horizon, Governor Patricia Wells signed an emergency stay of execution. Harold Tucker, who had spent 12 years preparing to die, was granted an indefinite reprieve while investigators reopened a case that everyone had considered closed. The legal machinery that had moved with glacial slowness when Harold was fighting for his life suddenly shifted into overdrive. FBI agents descended on Tyler County like an occupying army, armed with warrants and subpoenas and the kind of federal authority that made local officials very nervous about their past decisions. Detective Randall Mendel, now retired and living in a lakefront house, paid for by what everyone had assumed was wise investment, found himself the subject of an investigation that would unravel not just Sarah Beth Montgomery's murder, but a patterned murder of corruption that stretched back decades. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Mendel had been having an affair with Sarah Beth Montgomery, a relationship that had turned violent when she threatened to expose him to his wife and superiors. Phone records that had somehow never made it into the original case file showed dozens of calls between Mendel and the victim in the weeks before her death, including several heated exchanges on the night she died. DNA evidence that had mysteriously disappeared from the evidence locker was found in Mendel's personal files, where he had kept it as insurance against anyone who might threaten his version of events. When tested with modern techniques unavailable 12 years earlier, it conclusively proved that Mendel, not Harold, had been present at the crime scene. But perhaps most damning of all was the voicemail that investigators found on Mendel's old answering machine, apparently forgotten in the chaos of covering up his crime. It was Sarah Beth Montgomery's voice, terrified and desperate, calling for help as Mendel pursued her. "He's trying to kill me. I'm at Harold Tucker's place. If something happens to me, it was Randy Mendel. Tell my family I love them." The message had a timestamp that placed it 30 minutes before Mendel claimed to have arrived at the scene as an investigating officer. In a courtroom packed with reporters and cameras 3 months later, Randall Mendel sat in the defendant's chair where Harold Tucker had once been wrongly placed. His wife had divorced him, his pension had been revoked, and his fellow officers had distanced themselves from the man who had brought shame on their profession. When the judge asked how he pleaded to charges of murder, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence, Mendel's voice was barely audible. "Guilty, Your Honor." Harold Tucker sat in the gallery, no longer wearing prison whites, but dressed in a simple blue suit that Martha Simmons had bought for the occasion. Beside him, in a specially designed portable perch, Charlie preened his magnificent feathers, and occasionally muttered commentary that made reporters lean forward with their notebooks ready. When the judge sentenced Mendel to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Charlie squawked loudly, "Bad man, go away now." The courtroom erupted in laughter that carried more relief than humor, the kind of laughter that came from witnessing justice, finally, imperfectly, belatedly served. After the trial, Harold and Charlie returned to East Texas, where a legal settlement with the state provided enough money for Harold to buy a small house on 10 acres of pasture land near the Trinity River. It wasn't the 43 acres he had lost, but it was enough for a man and his bird to rebuild something resembling the life that had been stolen from them. The house was simple 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with windows that faced east toward the sunrise, and a wraparound porch where Charlie's large cage sat in the morning sun. Harold had learned not to want too much from life. 12 years in prison had taught him that freedom itself was the greatest luxury, that waking up without bars on his windows was a miracle he would never take for granted. Charlie adapted to their new life with the resilience that had carried him through 12 years of separation and trauma. He still remembered phrases from their old life together, and sometimes in the quiet evening hours, he would repeat conversations they had shared years before Harold's world collapsed. But he also learned new words, new songs, new expressions of the contentment that came from being reunited with the human he had never stopped loving. Neighbors in their rural community treated Harold with a mixture of curiosity and respect. His story had been national news for months, and people who met him often seemed surprised by his lack of bitterness, his quiet dignity, his apparent absence of rage at the system that had nearly killed him. What they didn't understand was that Harold had spent 12 years learning to let go of anger because it was the only way to survive. Hatred would have consumed him from the inside, leaving nothing for Charlie to come home to. On warm evenings, Harold would sit on his porch reading the newspaper aloud, while Charlie listened with the same attention he had shown years before. Sometimes visitors would come, reporters working on follow-up stories, legal scholars studying wrongful convictions, or simply people who had followed the case and wanted to meet the man and bird who had exposed such a fundamental failure of justice. Harold was always gracious with visitors, but he never sought publicity or attention. He had no interest in becoming a symbol or a crusader for criminal justice reform. He had lost 12 years of his life, and he wanted to spend whatever time remained living quietly, reading his newspaper, tending his small garden, and listening to Charlie's running commentary on the weather, the news, and the simple pleasures of a life lived in freedom. Sometimes, late at night when sleep eluded him, Harold would think about the randomness of fate that had brought him to the edge of death and then pulled him back. If Charlie had been adopted by someone else, if Martha Simmons hadn't been willing to make a 6-hour drive in the middle of the night, if Warden Morrison hadn't been moved by an unusual final request, any number of small changes might have resulted in Harold's execution and the truth dying with him. But perhaps it wasn't random at all. Perhaps love created its own kind of justice, operating by laws that human courts couldn't understand or quantify. Charlie had loved Harold enough to remember, to preserve the truth when everyone else had forgotten or chosen to ignore it. And that love, combined with the courage of strangers who risked their careers to do what was right, had been stronger than lies, corruption, and the momentum of a system that preferred convenient answers to difficult truths. On a morning exactly 1 year after his scheduled execution, Harold sat on his porch watching the sun rise over the East Texas hills, while Charlie preened his feathers and offered commentary on the approaching day. The newspaper lay folded beside Harold's coffee cup, but for once he wasn't reading the headlines about political scandals and international crises. Instead, he was simply enjoying the weight of Charlie on his shoulder, the bird's gentle grip on his shirt, the soft mumbling sounds the parrot made when he was content. "Good morning, sunshine," Harold said, using the phrase he had taught Charlie years before their separation. "Good morning, Harold," Charlie replied in Harold's own voice, then added in his own unique way, "Charlie love Harold. Harold home now, no more bad men." And in that moment, sitting on a porch he owned, watching a sunrise he had never expected to see, Harold Tucker understood that he had received something more valuable than vindication, or compensation, or apologies from the officials who had failed him. He had received the rarest gift of all, a second chance at the simple happiness that came from being loved unconditionally by another living being. The story of Harold Tucker and Charlie became legend in the small communities of East Texas, passed down in the way that stories of miraculous justice always are. Children learned about the parrot who saved an innocent man with nothing but memory and truth. Adults debated the implications of a case that had exposed corruption at every level of the criminal justice system. And somewhere in the back of everyone's mind was the comforting knowledge that sometimes, when human institutions failed completely, love found a way to prevail. Years later, when Charlie was very old and Harold's hair had gone completely white, visitors would still come to hear the story firsthand. Harold would tell it simply, without drama or embellishment, while Charlie added his own commentary from his perch on the porch railing. And every time, when Harold reached the part about Charlie's testimony in the prison visitation room, the bird would bob his head and say, in his clear, perfect voice, "Charlie, remember." Charlie, always remember. Truth is important. As the sun set on another day in their quiet corner of East Texas, Harold would often reflect on the strange journey that had brought them to this place of peace. He had lost 12 years, but he had gained something that many people never found: the absolute certainty that love was stronger than lies, that truth had its own power, and that sometimes the most unlikely voices carried the most important messages. And every night, as Charlie settled on his favorite perch and tucked his magnificent head under his wing, Harold would whisper the words that had become his prayer of gratitude. "You saved me when the whole world forgot. You remembered when everyone else chose to believe lies. You brought me home." In the morning, they would wake to another day of freedom, another sunrise over the Trinity River, another chance to live the simple life that had been stolen and then miraculously returned. And in that daily resurrection of hope, they found the kind of happiness that no system could take away, no lie could diminish, and no passage of time could destroy. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.